Building a portfolio with Fidelity Basket Portfolios is kind of like making a sandwich. It's as simple as picking your stocks and ETFs, sort of like your meats and other topics, and managing it as one big, juicy investment. Now that's pretty good. Learn more at fidelity.com/baskets. Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC. Member NYSE SIPC.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Cleveland area attorney and defender of freedom, Jay Carson, as well as in a special three-person episode, University of Northern Iowa political scientist Justin Holmes. And Jay and I are happy to have Justin on the show for his perspective, which I should point out is his alone and, should in no way be taken to represent that of the University of Northern Iowa, the great state of Iowa, or I guess anyone other than, Justin Holmes. Jay, I assume that goes for you too. You speak for yourself. And
yes.
As for me, I am the Lorax. I speak for the trees. So there you go. But anyway, Justin, great to have you here. And I'm looking forward to, talking with you and Jay about all the stuff that we have to talk about today. So why don't we just get right to it? But before we do, I want to make sure I thank Elijah, who's a new pre-trial Patreon supporter. Thank you so much for checking us out, potentially supporting us. We appreciate that. Okay. So I thought we'd start with the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court this week announced it would hear Donald Trump's appeal. It was denied by the D.C. Circuit concerning his immunity from prosecution for his alleged efforts to illegally influence the presidential election in 2020. Now, the unsigned order from the court scheduled oral argument for the week of April 22nd, and it's expected that the court may not actually issue a ruling until June. And even if they largely or entirely reject Trump's immunity claim, his trial would be unlikely to start until maybe sometime around September at the earliest, which, of course, raises the question of whether or not the Biden Justice Department would be willing to actually start a trial against a political opponent that would almost certainly be going on when people were voting and would prevent Trump from being out on the campaign trail as opposed to in a courtroom. And if the court finds that Trump has some immunity from criminal prosecution, then it's likely that the trial court will have to sort out which alleged criminal acts may be or may not be covered by immunity and which aren't, which could potentially delay the trial past the election and even into 2025. And it seems almost like a foregone conclusion for most people that if Trump does in fact win, in 2025, he would direct his attorney general to drop the case against him.
Stop prosecuting me.
Exactly. So now, nearly 3 months ago, special counsel Jack Smith asked the Supreme Court to hear a direct appeal of Trump's immunity claim, which would bypass the D.C. Circuit. And in that request, he cited the imperative public importance of the court to resolve the claim. The court denied this request, said, no, let the D.C. Circuit hear it. And then, of course, that three-judge panel, the D.C. Circuit, unanimously ruled against Trump on February 6th. Trump appealed to the Supreme Court on the 12th, after which it took the justices over 2 weeks to agree to even hear the case in the first place. And then they gave him 70 days, essentially, to prepare arguments that, by the way, have been briefed now twice. So the sole question that the court will be considering is whether, and if so, to what extent does a former president enjoy presidential immunity from criminal prosecution for conduct alleged to involve official acts during his tenure in office. So already in my comments, I think I gave a sense of how I feel about this. And so I thought we'd start with you, Jay, because you might have a slightly different take.
So first of all, I'll take a victory lap in that I said that the court would take this. I thought they should, and I'm glad they are. In terms of the timing, you seem to imply that this was I don't know, taking longer than it ought to. And in my sense is it's moving quicker than usual. And I think that's just our perspectives on the court. The fact that the court, took 2 weeks to make a decision on cert, that's moving pretty quick. So I'm not surprised that they took it, because I think this is a big issue that is bigger than Donald Trump. And the issue that has been teed up, and I think it's a good one, is the D.C. Circuit's opinion seems to conflict with the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Nixon versus Fitzgerald, which is a 1981 case. Now, Nixon versus Fitzgerald dealt with civil immunity, but I think there is obviously a good question as to whether, if civil immunity, and I should clarify, in Nixon versus Fitzgerald, what the court said was, and it was a 5-4 decision, was that the president enjoys absolute civil immunity for acts that are official acts and within the outer perimeter of his official acts. That case had to do with Nixon firing a Air Force accountant, essentially, who took issue with him and testified before Congress. And, the court essentially said, listen, this is, the president has a lot to do, and the Constitution correctly protects him from being distracted from these duties by the concern over civil suits. Now, in that case, it's unclear. Well, should this same rule apply to criminal suits? I think there's quite a good argument that it should. The argument against is, well, criminal cases have for more protections than what civil cases do. And I'm not sure I entirely buy that, but I think that tees up the argument, and I think it's an important question that the court ought to be taking up.
Justin, what do you think?
This is where I have to, play the I'm not a lawyer card in some ways in terms of process. But I do agree that with Jay that this is an important issue to take up. These are sort of big claims that the Supreme Court is there for when it comes to balancing powers and what, office holders can do. It is moving fast, but I think it probably needs to move fast just given sort of the context of things. This is something that comes to bear more or less immediately on the presidential election and, potential all kinds of things. So, I think in that sense, it makes sense that they're taking it and resolving it, presumably. I'm maybe a little more skeptical of the idea of presidential immunity just across the board. And I agree, it makes sense, for the reasons that Jay said, that you certainly wouldn't want to prosecute a sitting president or, open him up to civil suits or things like that for the distraction factor, and just then, anybody with an axe to grind could sue. On the other hand, I think a lot of what Trump's accused of here, and I think this may be, the big question for the court is, ultimately, were these accusations, these crimes Trump's accused of, are they within the purview of his job, or are they outside the realm of that? Thinking back to Nixon, certainly we didn't see this litigated, but, when Ford pardoned Nixon, that certainly implied that there might be a thought that he's open to lawsuits, at least, after the fact. So.
It seems like we all agree that this is an important question, and it is a question where there is at least some reasonable dispute. I think maybe where the disagreement is, Jay, you brought this up about the court's pace. I agree with you that the court is moving faster than it normally would. But let's take a look at the court's action in the Trump ballot eligibility case. They scheduled oral arguments for 34 days after they granted cert, compared to 70 days here. Or let's take a look at the court's action in the Nixon Watergate tapes, right? It took the court the entire process from the district court decision to the final decision of the Supreme Court, 54 days. The court can move very quickly when it wants to. Bush versus Gore is another example. And it seems to me that the court had to know, there's no way they couldn't know, that in setting the schedule they set, there would effectively be no way to give Donald Trump a fair trial before the election without at least impeding his ability to run as a political candidate. And that to me is, I am not, as you know, Jay, I am not a Supreme Court magnet.
You're going to go full can, aren't you?
I'm not. No, I'm not. But it is perplexing to me. The most charitable reading I have of this is that, well, maybe when the Supreme Court said, let's let the D.C. Circuit handle it, they were hoping or expecting that the D.C. Circuit would issue a ruling that would essentially say that Donald Trump had some sort of partial immunity, would spell that out, and they would be able to stay out of it. And the D.C. Circuit didn't do that. They basically said no immunity, and we count on the protections of the criminal process to make sure there aren't any frivolous criminal lawsuits. And the Supreme Court said, well, that's not what we were hoping for. I guess we got to take it up anyway. But even with that charitable
I think
reading,
that's a reasonable reading. Yeah.
Yeah. But even with that charitable reading, the idea that they would need 70 days to brief a case that they've briefed twice already, and the expectation now, and I hope this is wrong, that the court is going to not rule within a week or two after they hear that on the week of the April 22nd oral arguments, but wait until sometime in June. Given what that means for the trial, that's not going to happen before the election, I think that is, again, I don't want to go conspiracy mode, but I fail to understand how that makes any sense. So maybe you can give me a more charitable understanding of that, Jay, because I am lost.
Well, again, I would go just to, based on my experience and what schedules usually look like. I would say the standard, briefing schedule. Well, first of all, yeah, you usually get I want to say it's 45 days, but between exchanging briefs, there's usually a 30-day period, right? First side gets its 30 days to prepare, and the next, respondents get 30 days after. Then there is a reply brief, which is, I don't have it in front of me, but it's something like probably 15 days after. So that's sort of a normal sort of schedule, So again, I get it that this looks like the court is, to some would say this is slow walking. I would disagree, and in some cases you can argue, look, this gives the state, the federal government in this case, additional time to make its arguments.
I see what you're saying.
So,
let me be clear. Maybe
the other, and one more thing, I guess, is I think the court would be hard pressed to say, look, we want to hurry this up so that Trump, just in case we don't find immunity, Trump can get prosecuted in time for the election. That too would be a bad look.
Sure, but the very real question, I want to be clear on this before I ask you about this, Justin. I'm not arguing that the court is slow walking this. Clearly the court is taking this up under an expedited process. But given the almost certainty that this process means that should Donald Trump win the election, he will never be held to account for this. This is essentially the court saying that, well, if he wins the election, that's it. And they know that as a political reality. I'm not saying they're not moving faster than they normally do. What I'm saying is that they could move considerably faster still, as they have in other cases involving Donald Trump's eligibility, but they chose not to do that. Justin, what do you think?
I would tend to agree. I think just given particularly the time-sensitive nature of this, and honestly, I struggle to think, what the potential implications of this are, one way or the other. It feels like this could end up being some kind of October surprise almost that could blow up in any direction, depending on how long they drag this out. It is, thinking of it from kind of an electoral perspective, there's kind of a hope, I think, among a lot of Democrats that, Trump will be in jail before, this happens. And that was never in the time before the election happens. But that was really never in the timeline, I don't think, given the kind of when these cases ended up starting. But I do think, depending on what happens, certainly they could drop this, kind of later in the election cycle. And Trump, if they side with Trump, not only is it the potential for avoiding prosecution, but I think he would also treat it as a victory lap, in the court of public opinion where, hey, look, the corrupt Biden administration is coming after me and it's a political witch hunt. And, the Supreme Court agrees. And, dropping that late in the game, I think could have some real, electoral consequences too, depending on how they decide. I mean, it could blow up in his face also if they decide against him, but there won't be a resolution.
Jay, you were getting ready to say something there.
Yeah, so I agree with what Justin said on the, maybe, and this is what I was going to point out is there much difference in this case with if, say, you want it super expedited, right? Does that materially change the trial date? Let's say we move everything up, 30 days, get a decision out end of April, and then it goes back to the trial court to schedule. At that point, aren't we still looking at a trial right before a presidential election? And I think if I'm the Supreme Court and I'm weighing, one, the importance of the issue, two, the importance of the perception that this is being treated sort of in the normal course, and three, what difference it would make one way or the other. I think I would do this sort of, expedited, but not super expedited. I'd also draw a distinction between the ballot cases where we're talking eligibility and people are voting. I mean, primaries are going on right now, and there's a question as to, whether the president can be on the ballot. Super Tuesday's next week. So I think there's a difference there, and you can say there is more urgency on that case as opposed to the urgency of the federal government, like, we really, really, really want to prosecute him before it gets too close to the election. I think that's, to me, that's the there's a distinction there.
But I mean, it's a no-win situation for the person, for the federal government in that sense, because if you say, well, we really want to get this going before the election, then the argument is, well, this was rushed, and Donald Trump's not getting enough time to actually make his arguments, or his attorneys are. But then if you wait for a longer period, then the argument is, well, now we can't have the trial because Donald Trump is being prevented from being on the campaign trail and running for president. So, and then if it's delayed past that and Donald Trump wins, then there never is any trial. So basically, it seems to me that the government's in essentially a no-win situation here, is what you're saying.
Well, let me ask it this way. What do you think the government's interest ought to be in this case? And that's sort of because I think that's sort of an issue, right?
Absolutely. The government,
and when you say one is the interest of the government, or the other you would say is there an electoral interest of the Biden campaign? And that in itself is troubling, right? I do think if the government, the quote unquote government, is seen as, we want to hurry up and prosecute this guy because we want to make sure we can prosecute him before he's elected, that's a little troubling. And quite honestly, I think that accounts for a good deal of Trump's popularity in the polls. So I think we're looking at this in two different ways. The government's duty, the prosecutor's duty in this, is not to secure a conviction, but rather to see that justice is done. And there was a great line, and I'm forgetting, it's from a Supreme Court case about duties of prosecutor, and I should have printed it out beforehand. But it talks just about that the prosecutor is in a very special position, as opposed to your typical litigant, a civil litigant, right, whose job is to go out and represent the client. Their job is to represent justice and in all its forms. That would include presidential immunity. So that, to me, and look, theoretically, I would say if the court says that Trump is not immune and he wins, well, in 4 years, if there's a new administration, he could be prosecuted again. I don't know what the statute of limitations is, but I guess it's probably fairly lengthy on the types of things he's been accused of. So That's, and I guess the downside would be is the interest in. Well, I'll leave it there. I'll let you guys discuss amongst yourselves.
So let me say this. Let me summarize what I think the most charitable reading is again that the DC Circuit could have done more, and had they done more, the Supreme Court wouldn't have had to take up the case. But now they do, because they feel that more needs to be said, aside from the fact that, well, there is no immunity whatsoever, and that we just count on the system to sort of, to sort of weed out the frivolous cases. Now, one thing we haven't talked about is the actual substance. And we talked about this, Jay, you and I did when we looked at the DC Circuit's ruling. But there is a school of thought that agrees entirely with that, saying that, well, why should a president have immunity? That was a DC Circuit said, we have these protections. You can't just bring criminal suit like you can bring a civil suit. You have to get an indictment, right? Go through the grand jury process and all of these protections. And there are more protections, and no one's disputing that. You're saying, Jay, it sounds like that's not enough, and there potentially should be at least some immunity. And Justin, you haven't really jumped in on this topic. What do you think? Do you agree with the DC Circuit that basically there should be no immunity from criminal prosecution for former presidents?
I think that it is probably a matter of, it would depend on what, perhaps. I think in a lot of ways this sort of hinges on whether or not this is something that's part of his official duties. I think it would be a very clear-cut case, and he's not bringing, these arguments, say, in the New York fraud trial. Admittedly, that's, civil, but, that's clearly not part of his presidential duties or anything like that. I think there's a case to be made, on some level, in much the same way as protecting against, potentially frivolous civil suits, of some degree of immunity. But I think, the facts in this case, largely feel like he is operating, outside of official duties. I mean, his claim seems to be that he is. And I think that's something to be resolved. But I also think that's potentially something to be resolved, kind of in the trial courts in a lot of ways, because it sort of centers around the facts of the circumstances. It's certainly a question of law, as well. But, I don't think that there's necessarily no immunity. But this certainly feels like a case that boy is kind of outside of the scope of things that ought to be protected.
Yeah, and in a way, I should point out, you could argue that a ruling here potentially protects Joe Biden more than it might protect Donald Trump if Donald Trump wins. And so,
absolutely,
because certainly it is not at all difficult to envision Donald Trump on his 2025 revenge tour instructing whatever lickspittle gets to be attorney general to basically go after Joe Biden. And if you have to make up charges, you go ahead and do that. He's a bad hombre. We need to take him down. I don't know. He probably wouldn't say that exactly, but maybe he would. I don't know. But the point being is that protection would be there for all future presidents. And Jay, I know that's something that you agree with.
Yeah, and to me, that's why if I'm the court, I have to look at this is a bigger issue than who's president in 2024 or who wins the election in 2024. Because look, there are a lot bigger things at stake, and so for example, I'd ask you to spare a thought for Anwar al-Awlaki. I don't know if you remember him. He was an American citizen who was in Yemen. Now he was a I would say, I would characterize him as a very, very bad guy. He was a terrorist. He was killed by an intentional drone strike by the Obama administration. I think the statute of limitations for murder is probably 20 years, something like that. Could a federal prosecutor bring a murder charge against Barack Obama, perhaps against Eric Holder as well, for the murder of a U.S. citizen? Now, look, I would argue that the drone strike on a terrorist is clearly within the president's scope of responsibility as commander in chief. And while I disagree with Barack Obama on a whole lot of things, I was with him on this. But imagine the consequences, and this is sort of drawing from the Nixon versus Fitzgerald case. If you say, well, civil suits are really a pain and can distract the president and might chill the president from taking action if they could be civilly liable, how much more chilling is criminal liability? How much more chilling is criminal liability, especially in this type of on a war footing? Would a president pull his punches from taking this kind of action if you could be criminally prosecuted down the line, especially, and again, with a long statute of limitations?
And I think that while I was going to say nobody is arguing that presidents or ex-presidents are entirely above the law. That's not true. Actually, Donald Trump's attorney said basically that, no, that is an argument, but almost nobody thinks that is a reasonable argument and the outcome that we will get. But as you point out, Jay, there are complexities involved when you're dealing with the president, who's not just another private citizen who happens to have this job, like the example that you cite, and there are others that others have cited as well. So it gets a little bit tricky. And I feel like those who sort of simplify the question down to, well, the president's either subject to the law or not, to me, it's just not quite that straightforward, unfortunately. And sometimes you have to make trade-offs like in the civil cases. And I think that's why the Supreme Court does need to rule on this. And again, I'm just disappointed it's going to take as long as it did. But there'll certainly be more on that when we get to oral.
Can I throw in one last little piece? And this is going to sound really counterintuitive, and I'll probably get all the hate on this. But the Trump argument is not inconsistent with what the Nixon versus Fitzgerald argument is, where they say, no, absolute immunity. For acts, within the official capacity or within the outside perimeter. Now, I would agree with Justin. I think there's, that outside perimeter stuff, there's some factual issues, right, mixed up in there that probably are more appropriate for the trial court to deal with than the Supreme Court. So even if, it gets sent back, you're still going to take more time. But the issue is that the D.C. Circuit tended to say, there is no immunity, and there is this no one is above law. I would suggest, and this is going to sound controversial and shocking, but in some cases, yes, the president is above the law, or at least above the law as the judiciary can impose it upon him. You could say there are other hedges, those being political, those being concerns for the president's future reputation, impeachment, and it's odd that even in Nixon versus Fitzgerald, which was decided in 1981, Nixon had been out of office for 8 years then. The court said, yeah, impeachment's an important remedy. So I think that's an issue. And what the court is weighing, right? What you're weighing is the potential prosecution of one officer. And I'd also point out that most federal officers have broad immunity for what they do within their scope of their jobs, versus damage to the balance of powers and that's one of those. It's sort of akin to the better one guilty man go free than the 9 innocents be convicted, or the other way around. Not better than 9 guilty people go free. You know what I'm saying?
Yes, basically.
But it's sort of the same thing. Is better one guilty president go unpunished, at least officially by the judiciary, than we have damage to the balance of powers, and that the judiciary thence controls the presidency. I really want to read. There was a. Can I point of personal privilege?
Okay. Just
because you love them and I love them, but in Nixon versus Fitzgerald, the court cites a letter from Thomas Jefferson, exactly addressed to the prosecutor, because this came up in the context of Jefferson, who was the sitting president at the time, gets a subpoena from the prosecutor to come and testify at the Aaron Burr trial. And Jefferson responds, the leading principle of our Constitution is the independence of the legislature, executive, and judiciary of each other, and none are more jealous of this than the judiciary. But would the executive be independent of the judiciary if you're subject to the commands of the latter, emphasis in Jefferson's original, and to imprisonment and for disobedience? If the several courts could bandy him from pillar to post, keep him constantly trudging from north to south and east to west, and withdraw him entirely from his constitutional duties. The intention of the Constitution that each branch should be independent of the other is further manifested by the means that is furnished to each to protect itself from enterprises of force attempted on them by the others. And none has given more effectual or diversified means than to the executive. That's Thomas Jefferson, Mike. So I know you put high value on that.
I find it to be totally, crap, basically. But I will end this segment using my point of personal privilege by ignoring Thomas Jefferson, as he so roundly deserves in so many areas, and actually referring back to something of that same era. There's a far more reputable individual, Chief Justice John Marshall, in Marbury versus Madison. I think there was a passage, because I've been rereading that actually this morning. I was rereading it, thinking about executive immunity and privilege and separation of powers and that. And one passage that really struck me was when Marshall wrote, the conclusion is that from this reasoning, where the heads of departments are the political or confidential agents of the executive merely to execute the will of the president, or rather to act in cases in which the executive produces a constitutional or legal discretion, nothing can be more perfectly clear than that their acts are only politically examinable. Now, that to me in fact was part of the argument that Donald Trump's attorneys made, and it is not at all ironclad. It is open to dispute, but my point is this is not an issue of, is Donald Trump above the law, yes or no? And so there, I'll leave it at that, with John Marshall, hoping that people will just forget Thomas Jefferson. So
yeah, John Marshall, was Thomas Jefferson's cousin.
Well, you can't pick your
They didn't get along. They didn't see eye to eye on a whole lot.
Like a conflict of interest of sorts.
Exactly. Yeah. Washington hated Jefferson too. Everyone, decent person, hated Jefferson. John Adams did. Anyway, okay, moving on from that. I'll try to get off my Jefferson hatred.
But this was the piece I quoted was Justice Powell.
Okay.
Quoting Thomas Jefferson.
Well, see, that's still anyway, but
So
the less we can bring Thomas Jefferson into any argument, I think the better it is. But that's me, and I'm right. Okay, let's move on to something entirely different, guys. Last week when May and I were recording the episode, we do that Saturday mornings, just like now. The Michigan primary was going on, and so we didn't get a chance to talk about that. And I'll just say, to absolutely no one's surprise, both Joe Biden, Donald Trump breezed a victory. Trump got 68.1%, 12 delegates. Haley got 26.6%, 4 delegates. Joe Biden, 81.1, and 115 delegates, though uncommitted was not a strong second, but second, 13.2%, and 2 delegates. So I didn't find much surprising here, but I felt like, it's important to mention here, and there have been some talk about it. Justin, is there anything, when you look at the Michigan primary results, anything that jumped out to you, or you're like, pretty much as expected?
It was a little unexpected, actually. There's a little bit to unpack. Obviously the top line numbers are pretty obvious, and really that's been baked in from the beginning that, clearly this is going to be a Trump versus Biden rematch. And I don't think there's been, since the Iowa caucus forward, I don't think there's been a whole lot of doubt about that. I do think, this does highlight something, and where this goes, if this spills into the general, remains to be seen. But, for both of them being the front runners and one being the incumbent and, frankly, Trump sort of running as a pseudo incumbent in his way, their support here both seems a little bit soft, to my mind. The Trump, he's clearly running against an actual person, and he's not the incumbent. So the dynamics are clearly a little different there. But, he's certainly beating Haley pretty handily, but not by maybe as much as you'd think, at this point in the game. And for Biden, this stronger than expected showing, I think, of uncommitted, goes to, some fractures within the party a little bit. I don't think it's, fatal by any means. But it is, even if this is just a preview of Michigan in the fall, that's, the margin in 2016 and 2020 was, low 5 digits. It was about 10,000 votes in 2016. There were 100,000 uncommitteds. And so there is some question, will these folks show up and vote? Was this an aberration? Are they a drop in the bucket? Or, is that a legit problem? When you have 100,000 people that bothered to go to, the Democratic primary and then not vote for you, is that a sign of trouble ahead in a pretty important swing state?
Before I turn it to you, Jay, I do want to put that uncommitted vote in at least a little bit of recent historical perspective. 13.2% voted uncommitted, at which certainly that's not nothing, right, over Biden. But I'll point out that the last time an incumbent Democrat was running for re-election, that would be Obama in 2012, in the Michigan Democratic primary, 10.7% chose uncommitted. So that 13.2% is still more than that, certainly. But putting it in perspective, it's not like, oh my God, some historically profoundly crazy rebuke. Jay?
Yeah. I would agree, and I think Justin's right in that what remains to be seen is whether these voters come home in November. I think my sense is most of them will, right? When it comes down to the binary choice, and this has been the argument. I think I've seen a lot of Republicans making, saying, well, if people are voting for Nikki Haley, they are therefore never Trumpers and will either vote for Biden or just not vote in November. I think that's true for a percentage of them, but I don't think it's true for the majority of them. So, we'll wait and see. But I think basing this idea, saying, oh, we're just going to subtract those numbers from the candidates' November vote totals right now is premature.
Yeah, I certainly would agree with that. And this ties in at least a little bit to something that came out literally just before we get on the air, and listeners, at this point, you probably have seen it, some of you, that new New York Times Siena College poll that has Biden at 43 to Trump at 48. But I think there's also a pretty significant enthusiasm gap between Biden supporters and Trump supporters. Something like 23% of Democrats say they're highly enthusiastic about Biden compared to 48% for Trump. And I think a lot of that is not terrifically surprising. We're going to see those margins narrow a whole lot. And so sort of the optimistic view of this, as well as for Michigan, for the Biden administration and for Democratic voters and supporters, is that, well, these margins tend to narrow. They're the Biden campaign hasn't really swung in. The voters will come home for the large part, and it's going to come to basically persuading that small number of independents. And I think the Biden campaign is counting on reminders of all the stuff going on with Trump to get enough of those folks in swing states to kind of move over there, though we have not seen that movement yet, and we probably won't see it for a little while longer. Justin, any thoughts on that?
I agree with, I think, most of that, and with Jay, these polls this far out still don't tell us a whole lot, honestly, and that gap is basically within the margin of error, on the high side of the margin of error, but it's certainly not a slam dunk for anything. Not to mention we haven't experienced the entire campaign yet. So, that certainly has an impact. And, I think people do mostly come home. I've been skeptical as well. There are these various polls showing that, a quarter of Haley voters wouldn't support Trump. And I find that fairly unlikely. The one thing that where I do take this maybe a little more seriously, and frankly, for both of them, I think both candidates have this issue, is, we do spend a lot of time focusing on swing voters, which, you've admitted there aren't very many of anymore. But the other part of this story that I think often gets overlooked is turnout and get out the vote efforts. And, I think there is an enthusiasm problem there to an extent where things like this do make me a little more, a little more of the mind that this could have some impact. On the other hand, it could be an offsetting impact for both of them, where, when these margins are so tight, flipping a vote, certainly that's essentially worth 2, right? You would take it off one person's pile and add it to the other. But an abstention is still worth 1, for the other guy. And, when you get down to these margins, I'm looking back at 16 and perhaps still bitter. But, when we look at, it's like 70,000 votes across 3 states, I think it's fair to say that, 70,000, Bernie supporter abstentions, more or less swung the election. I mean, lots of other things swung the election too. But especially in these tight races like we're seeing, and especially, very tight individual states, I think this turnout stuff is perhaps more important than it gets credit for. The flip side of that, there's enthusiasm, and then there's, abject horror at the other person winning. And so I think, Biden, where he may have a bit of an advantage, Trump supporters are loyal. I'm not sure that anybody is all that enthusiastic about Biden. I certainly remember being at the 2020 caucuses and his group was pretty dull. But, they can probably get behind somebody, and certainly, he's going to come out swinging with a lot of anti-Trump rhetoric to make this a referendum on Trump. And I think that gets most of those people back in the end, that, they're finally, that's probably what gets them to come home. It's not that anybody's super excited about Joe Biden in a lot of ways, but boy, a lot of Democrats would do pretty much anything to not have Trump again.
Okay.
So I would just add one last observation. And that is, to a large extent, the Trump abstentions, never Trumper type votes are personal, meaning, look, it's we just don't like this guy personally because of his character, et cetera, et cetera. Some of the Biden problems, I think, tend to be more coalitional, and I think that may be more of a problem, especially in a state like Michigan. And I'm thinking, specifically about Arab Americans, right, which are a big voting bloc in Michigan, or at least a big enough part of a coalition that if they were to stay home en masse, could make a difference. Likewise, African Americans have been trending not to bringing in the percentages that one would be expected in a typical election for Democrats. So I think that's an issue that's maybe a little bit different, in that there are the African American. One of the complaints is with immigration policy. So I think that's, again, I'm not saying it changes anything one way or another, but I do think there's a difference in terms of one being a coalitional group versus just a bunch of individuals who don't like Trump's character.
There's certainly a long way to go, and a lot can happen, and it still is very early. But the final word on this, I'll take for myself, is that if you're looking at the polls, you would much rather be in Donald Trump's position than in Joe Biden's position, whether it's the national polls or the swing state polls. Right now, things look a lot better for Donald Trump than they do for Joe Biden. So let's move on to something that has, well, I won't say has nothing to do with presidential politics, but a little less so, at least. That's the short-term continuing resolution, because late this week, Congress actually avoided a government shutdown, a good thing, most people would say, not everyone, by passing legislation that gives them a few more weeks to wrap up their ongoing appropriation negotiations. And they split the extensions that they approved into 2 parts. The first has a March 8th deadline, and that covers 6 of the 12 annual spending bills. And then the second one has a deadline that's March 22nd, and it has the other half of those bills. And for that first part, the final text hasn't been released, but Speaker Johnson says it's going to be out and be voted on in this next week. And the most conservative members of the caucus almost certainly going to be unhappy with the final measure. Johnson, in fact, said, hey, if you're expecting a lot of home runs and grand slams here, I admit you'll be disappointed, but we will be able to secure a number of policy victories. And he said that to his caucus, you should be proud of this progress, especially considering how narrow the majority in the chamber is. Now, that second group, well, it's unclear at this point how close legislators are actually to a deal here, which kind of explains the longer extension. And those extensions passed with large bipartisan majorities in both chambers, 320 to 99 in the House, 77 to 13 in the Senate. And of course, Speaker Johnson needed plenty of Democratic votes. In fact, nearly 2/3 of the support for this came from the minority party in the House. And on the Senate side, all 13 of those no votes came from Republicans, pretty much the usual suspects, Blackburn, Cruz, Hawley, Johnson, Lee, Tuberville, Vance. And there were 10 senators who actually didn't cast a vote, 9 Republicans and Democrat-ish Joe Manchin. So that's where we are with the continuing resolution thing. Jay, I'll start with you. What do you think about this latest CR or group of CR?
On the merits, I'm not crazy about it. As I'm not crazy about CRs in general, and we've preached for years and years and years that we ought to return to regular order and all of that. That said, on the politics of it, I think it's a smart move, because I think the iron law that I try to preach to everyone is that Republicans always lose government shutdowns, always and forever. So don't shut down the government. But so anyway, I don't have terribly strong feelings. It's one of these. It's spending more money than I would like to see spent, but I'm all for the 3 yards and a cloud of dust kind of approach.
So, Justin, what's your take on this?
Boy, it certainly feels like nothing earth-shattering. I would tend to agree with Jay that, the politics of this seem to kind of blow back on Republicans, and frankly, it sort of surprises me. I mean, it feels like, Lucy in the football a little bit, where there's this, Freedom Caucus element that I think are convinced that, the American public's going to see the wisdom of their ways by shutting down the government. And it certainly never seems to work that way. I would also agree it would be really nice to go back to not doing this. The number of times I'm in front of a class and say, hey, it looks like the government's going to shut down again next week if, something doesn't happen. It's just, it's just exhausting and really not great governance, with that. So I think, getting back to kind of a more normal budgeting process and frankly, I'm not a fan of the debt ceiling just in general it seems like a sort of sets up these situations all the time without really gaining a whole lot. It drives up the stakes and actually does get a shutdown periodically. So, but as far as this specific one, so far I don't have a lot to say about it.
Yeah, I'll remind folks that Mike Johnson, when he was campaigning for the job of Speaker, which God knows why you'd want to be a Republican Speaker at this point, but promised that there would be no CRs on his watch. And in fact, all of the 12 individual spending bills would be voted on by the deadline. And of course, that was either Mike Johnson is the most naive man in Congress, or he knew he was lying to gain the support of the Freedom Caucus folks. And I think the latter is almost certainly the case. And that, in fact, happened. Now, Johnson has sort of claimed, well, hey, we did break it into 2. And he said, so this is a sign, right? We're on the right track. The omnibus fever, as he called it, has been broken. And so voting on 2 separate bills of 6 is better than voting on 1 of 12. And we're moving in the right direction, to which Chip Roy, who's, I think, a pretty representative of the Freedom Caucus, said, it's just the swamp doing what the swamp does. And honestly, a lot of what the swamp does is, I think, pretty much okay, at least if you compare it to the Freedom Caucus alternative, as far as I'm concerned. So final question, guys. Will we have a shutdown? I think it's almost certain we're not going to have a shutdown on March 8th. Those bills seem to be pretty close to being, approved, I think. But will we have a shutdown on March 23rd, do you think, after that second deadline? Or do you think we will come to the brink and enough Republicans with some Democrats will say, nope, we're not going to go there? What do you think? Let's start with you, Justin.
I'm inclined to say, just after the kind of backlash that we've had with the public in the past over these things, these shutdowns, I'm inclined to say that they'll probably try to avert it. I think we saw this, with this batch here. You can win over enough Republicans, and if all the Democrats are on board, it's certainly not a way that Republicans and Republican leadership would like to be. But I think they don't want to get caught holding the bag when everything shuts down and facing that backlash. So my suspicion is they'll get it done, but I wouldn't hold me to that by any means.
Okay. Jay?
My sense would be a similar, there should be no shutdown. It would be a political malpractice for the Republicans to force the shutdown, given their advantage on other issues that voters are going to vote on. Why would you bring in this distraction? So I doubt it, but I never want to discount Republicans' ability to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. So
then I guess, the argument from the Freedom Caucus folks is that we need to do this because we are on not just an unsustainable path, but this is an imminent danger, essentially, this deficit spending. And we have to use this leverage while we have it, because there's a very real chance that in 2025, the Republicans won't be in control in the House of Representatives. And so I guess, Jay, you're a Republican here on this. What do you think about that logic? If you are a diehard fiscal conservative just freaking out over deficits, how do you respond to these people? What do you say to the Chip Roys of Congress?
The response is make the best deal you can get and move on and make a better deal the next time. If your plan is, listen, we understand we're going to lose seats. So, I think that's sort of just a bizarre sort of way to look at this, right? The goal is, listen, if nothing's going to get fixed until you have a majority. And even then, right? I think so many Republicans have complained for years and years and years, myself among them, that even when you have majority, spending never actually goes down. Maybe the pace of spending slows a little, but losing, you at least have to, I get it that the numbers say it's likely the Democrats take back the House this year. But that doesn't mean you hand it over to them. You know what I mean? And in exchange for what, right? Again, you get the shutdown and do you, a shutdown doesn't really change the numbers at the end of the day.
Right. So, and in that Johnson has demonstrated that he will get Democratic votes in order to avert a shutdown. And that's going to be more of a priority to him than kind of making sure.
And look, we're in a situation where the Freedom Caucus folks, you're going to have people who are able to, take a walk on this one, or vote no, because there'll be enough Democrat votes to get it through. But I just don't see this as the hill worth dying on this election cycle.
Yeah, and I know that there are a lot of House Republicans who are deeply unhappy with Mike Johnson, but I wonder how much of that unhappiness is performative, though yet from what we hear and, behind the scenes leaks from closed caucus meetings that no, it's a very real anger. And it kind of just makes me wonder what those folks actually thought Mike Johnson would be able to do. It seems to me that I certainly disagree with him on a lot, but given the position he is in and given the narrow majority, I actually think he's, all things considered, doing probably about the best he can by his caucus, even though I think that's directionally and policy-wise wrong for the country.
That's sort of my point. The numbers are what they are, and they're not going to change. You're not going to pick up substantially more Republican votes and be able to substantially move that number, and especially considering you got to get it through the Senate as well. So,
but it certainly is good for the fundraising for those particular members who can speak out on it and walk away and have that free vote, as you often talk about it as, Jay. All right. Well, that about brings us to the end of our regular show, but there are a bunch of things we wanted to get to that we didn't have time for. We will be getting to them on our midweek supporters show. We want to talk about more Trump trial stuff, Biden and Trump's dueling border visits, Mitch McConnell stepping down, maybe take some listener questions, a whole bunch of stuff. And if you are a supporter, you'll be getting that on Tuesday, as always. And if you're not a supporter, we hope you'll consider becoming one. To get that and a bunch of other stuff like ad-free versions of everything we release, that full-length midweek supporters episode instead of just a little bit of a preview, access to our Discord group, which lately has just been nuts. I've been going back and forth with a bunch of people both on the right and on the left. I argue with everyone on that group, essentially. No one's happy. Anyway, a bunch of things. You can support us on Patreon, which offers a free trial, as I mentioned at the top of this show. All kinds of other ways to check it all out. Just look in the show notes, or you can go to politicsguys.com/support. And whether you're a supporter or not, we would really appreciate it if you haven't already, if you could subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you use, as well as spread the word on social media. If you want to get in touch with us, there's mail at politicsguys.com, our email address. We're also on that Discord channel, as I mentioned, for supporters, as well as Facebook and X, and you will find links to them in the show notes. And finally, as always, a very special thanks to our fantastic executive producers. They are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. We'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.